Hi friends, today for math we're going to begin learning how to tell time. Today we're going to be telling time to the hour. So one of the things that you're going to be hearing a lot is us saying o'clock. Today we're going to be reading clocks that have different times, but we're always going to be using the term o'clock at the end since we're telling time to the hour. Let's practice saying that together. O'clock. Excellent. Today we're going to be using two different types of clocks to practice telling time. One is a little bit easier than the other, but it's important that we know how to tell time on both types of clocks. The first type of clock that we're going to talk about today is a digital clock. Digital clocks are lots of different places. I have a digital clock on my phone. You can see the time is at the top and Cooper's picture. And I also have a digital clock on my watch here. Again, I have the time written like this. On a digital clock, what we're going to see is numbers and dots. And it looks something like this. First, we see a number. This number is anywhere from 1 to 12. Then we see two little dots like this. These dots are called a colon. You don't really have to know that, but if you remember that, that would be cool. And then second, we see another number. This number is anywhere from 0 to 60. The first number here in this clock shows the hour of the day. So in this time here, 10 is our hour. The purple number on the other side of the two dots shows the minute. When the minute says 00, like this example, that's when we use that fancy term and we say, o'clock. Today, all of the times that we're going to practice are going to have 00 at the end, and they're going to say o'clock. If I wanted to read this time on the digital clock, this time would be 10 o'clock. Today, we're going to be switching just this first number, the hour number. If I wanted to read this time on the digital clock, I would read this time as 6 o'clock. Here, let me have you try one now. If I wrote this time on the digital clock, tell me how you would read that time. Go ahead now and read that time out loud. Excellent. We would read this as 8 o'clock. This is the digital clock, which is a little bit easier than the other type of clock that we're going to talk about. Let me show you what the other type of clock looks like. This type of clock is called an analog clock. Can you say that with me? Analog clock. This is the type of clock that we usually see hanging on a wall. Both KA and KB have one of these in our classroom. You might even have a watch that has an analog clock on it. Analog clocks are a little bit trickier to read, but it's important that we practice learning how to tell time. When you get really good at reading analog clocks, instead of paying attention to the number, you might be able to remember the pattern that our hands are in instead of looking at the numbers, which is really cool. On our analog clock, I want you to notice a few things before we start reading different times. On our analog clock, we have two different hands. The shorter hand, our hand is going to be red on our clock, is the hour hand. This hand tells us what hour it is in the day. And the purple hand on the clock is the minute hand. The minute hand is always longer than the hour hand. They're not always different colors like an our clock, but you can tell the difference between them depending on how long they are. On your analog clock, you also might notice numbers. They start at the top with the number 12. And then they go around counting back until we get to 12 again. We call this direction that they go in clockwise. That's the counting direction on our clock. The hands, as the day goes on, are going to move around the clock. The other thing that you might notice on your clock is some clocks have these little dashes to show the minutes. Now, the minutes are a little bit trickier to read on a clock because they don't follow the same numbers as an hour. There are 12 hours in our day, but there are 60 minutes in an hour. So when we read the minute, we're going to be counting by fives. Let's practice counting by fives together to show what the minutes on the clock would be. So we start at the top at 0, and then we're going to go 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55. This would be 60, but it also starts again at 0 because this is a circle. Today, when we read times on our analog clock, the minute hand is always going to be pointed to the 12 or the 0, and this is where we say o'clock. We're going to be paying attention to which number the red hand is pointing to read the different hour that it's at. One thing that can be a little bit tricky is that our red hand is so short that sometimes it doesn't exactly touch the number for the hour. But instead, we have to imagine that there's a line connecting the number to the hour hand. If I were to read this time on the clock, I would read this as 3 o'clock. Let me show you another example. If I wanted to read this number on the clock, this time on the clock, I would read this as 5 o'clock. If I wanted to read this time on the clock, I would read this as 7 o'clock. Now you try one. What time is this showing on the clock? Use your eyes to connect the hour hand to the number. Use an imaginary line to connect the number to the hour hand. Go ahead and say that time out loud. Very good. This time would be read as 9 o'clock. Let me let you try one more. Try to trick you here. Go ahead and read that time out loud. Very good. This time would be read as 11 o'clock. Excellent. Today for your activity, you're going to be practicing reading analog clocks. They're all pointed at the 0, so they all have an O clock at the end. You're going to be matching digital times to analog times and practice reading times on both kinds of clocks.